You climb down into a sunken stone chamber, and the temperature drops. The walls close in. Upright pillars ring the space, and along the floor, a line of carved stone phalloi rises like a frozen audience. Then, at midwinter, a thin blade of sunlight is said to slip inside and cut the darkness like a scalpel. The question is simple. Was that beam built on purpose, or are we narrating a coincidence? Karahan Tepe comes from the same world as Göbekli Tepe, monument builders before cities, before pottery, before metal. But the vibe is different. Göbekli feels open and performative. Karahan feels designed. Where you enter, where you stand, what you face, what you're allowed to see. And if this chamber was roofed, even partly, sunlight wouldn't just fall in, it would arrive on schedule. In the next few minutes, we're going to test the winter alignment claim step by step. What kind of opening could create a beam like that? The roofed versus unroofed debate, what the light might be targeting, and how sky simulation visuals can tell us whether this is repeatable physics or modern myth-making. This is armchair archaeology. We take ancient sites apart like puzzles, then rebuild them with context, skepticism, and a love for the truly strange human choices hiding in stone. No mystical shortcuts, just evidence, possibilities, in the story the ruins are actually capable of telling. Stay to the end, because one overlooked detail at Karahan Tepe flips the solstice idea from a cool sunbeam into ritual technology, architecture that doesn't just mark time, it moves a crowd. Karahan Tepe doesn't offer an easy entry point. It lies across the dry uplands of southeastern Anatolia, where the terrain looks empty until you notice how often the bedrock has been cut, shaped, and worked again. This isn't a place you stumble into. It's a place people kept choosing, again and again. At first glance, it's tempting to reduce Karahan Tepe to a single strange chamber, something unusual, dramatic, and contained. Step back, and that idea starts to collapse. The excavated areas don't form a neat boundary. Survey work shows anomalies beyond the visible structures, subtle rises and patterns under the soil that suggest more walls, more cuts, more planning. What's exposed isn't the site, it's a fragment of it. This kind of planning shows up earlier than most people expect. The builders had no cities, no pottery, no metal, no written records. Yet they shaped stone on a scale that required coordination, repetition, and shared expectations over time. Tools had to be made, labor had to be organized, knowledge had to be passed on. Whatever happened here, it wasn't improvised. Nothing about Karahan Tepe is particularly practical. The structures don't store food, they don't shelter families, they don't produce tools. Instead, they organize space, narrow approaches, sunken areas, upright forms that guide where bodies move and where attention settles. It's closer to what modern designers do with theaters and stadiums, except the show here is carved into bedrock. Standing at the edge of the complex, the surrounding landscape stops reading as empty. Paths, gatherings, returns, these leave no footprints after 10 millennia, but the stone still marks where people were meant to go. The sunken chamber isn't an isolated curiosity. It sits where a community would have focused effort, memory, and expectation, long before anyone had words for monuments or calendars. If stories like this change how you see the past, you'll fit right in here. Subscribe so you don't miss the next dig.
The descent is part of the design. Karahan Tepe's sunken chamber isn't something you casually wander into, the way you drift through an open ruin. You approach it, then you drop, stepping down into a space that places your body below the surrounding ground, as if the site is taking you in on its own terms. The air feels different down there. The walls rise closer. Sound changes in tight stone spaces. Footsteps and voices don't travel the same way they do under open sky. Before you register a single carving, the architecture has already set the tone. Inside, upright pillars ring the enclosure like silent figures. They don't read as supports the way a modern mind expects. They read as presences, tall forms that pull your gaze upward, forms that narrow your options for where to stand and where to move. The chamber's shape funnels bodies into certain lanes and pauses, nudging a group into a shared orientation without anyone needing to direct it. A carved head emerging from the stone pushes the space even further toward the human. Not a portrait, not quite a god, just a face that insists on being recognized. In a confined room, recognition travels fast. People follow each other's attention. A glance becomes a cue. The chamber doesn't just contain objects, it stages relationships between watchers and watched, between the living crowd and the carved forms that outlast them. It's easy to picture this place as static, like a museum display frozen in time. But the layout reads like something built for returns, for gathering, for witnessing, for doing a sequence the same way often enough that it becomes tradition. A sunken floor sets a boundary. A ring of uprights sets a perimeter. A focal carving creates a front, even if no one ever calls it that. When the winter solstice alignment argument comes up, the chamber's job becomes clearer. This is a space designed to concentrate attention, like a blackout theater before the curtain lifts. Light is only part of the effect. The room itself makes people ready to notice it. No matter how prepared you think you are, the floor features in Karahan Tepe's sunken chamber hit hard. Dozens of upright stone forms rise from the bedrock, unmistakably phallic in shape, arranged in deliberate rows rather than scattered at random. They're not tucked away at the edges either. They occupy the space where people would have stood, moved, and looked. Impossible to ignore, impossible to pass through without noticing your own body in the room. It's tempting to file them under one quick explanation: fertility symbols, masculinity on display, some primal cult of reproduction. But the layout refuses to stay in that box. These stones don't behave like icons meant only to be seen. They behave like a designed surface. Obstacles, markers, rhythm makers, breaking the chamber into lanes and pauses. You don't just observe them, you navigate them. The room teaches you spacing. In early ritual spaces, meaning often arrives through movement as much as imagery. Walking between upright stones forces distance between people, dictates where you can stop, and shapes how a group gathers without anyone running the room. The Phalloi can start to read less like anatomy and more like crowd shaping, proximity, order, attention, built into the floor itself. The placement is evidence. The meaning is a hypothesis. It's the same logic behind modern cues and concert barriers, only here the barriers are symbolic as well as physical.
Across Neolithic Anatolia, carved forms regularly blur the line between human, animal, and abstract power. These stones are exaggerated, standardized, and repeated, as if the point wasn't individuality, but accumulation.
One might read as a symbol. Dozens create a condition, a field of presence filling the chamber. Set beneath looming pillars, inside a sunken enclosure, the effect becomes almost architectural. The ground isn't neutral, it's active. Whatever people did here, it demanded awareness of your footing, your neighbors, and the space pressing in from every side. The stones turn an empty room into an experience, and they make it difficult to remain a spectator. For anyone who likes to follow these clues with a notebook open, the Ancient Secrets mug, Armchair Archaeology Edition, was made for long, quiet reads, weighty ceramic, clean print, and a reassuring kind of permanence. It's linked in the pinned comment and description.
A winter solstice alignment sounds abstract until it's reduced to mechanics. At the winter solstice, the sun travels low across the sky, and that shallow angle changes how light behaves. Instead of flooding a space from above, it enters sideways, narrow, directional, able to trace a path rather than fill a room. That's why some ancient structures look ordinary most of the year, then shift dramatically during the brief seasonal window. At Karahan Tepe, The requirements are straightforward. There has to be a controlled opening, something that limits when and how sunlight enters. That could be a doorway, a slit between stones, a deliberate gap in a wall, or an angled passage that only sees the sun when it reaches a specific position. If the chamber was even partially roofed, the interior would stay dark enough for a beam to appear sharply defined. In an open structure, the same sunlight could still arrive, but it would spread out, losing contrast and focus. The interior layout matters just as much as the opening. Upright pillars and floor features don't merely occupy space, they constrain it. A beam of low-angle light can be blocked by a single edge or threaded through a narrow corridor of stone. If light reaches a particular point inside the chamber consistently, it does so because the surrounding elements keep that path clear. Geometry does the gating, like a lens hood that only lets the right angle through. The solstice is suited for this kind of timing. The sun's position changes slowly at the turning point, lingering near its lowest extreme. That makes the window repeatable from year to year. In a darkened chamber, a short, predictable arrival like that wouldn't blend into the background. The claim about Karahan Tepe depends less on symbolism at first and more on repeatability. If the architecture could make the winter solstice visible inside the chamber, then the seasonal change wouldn't just be known, it could be witnessed together. On cue, Karahan Tepe's alignment claim turns on a deceptively simple question. How much of this chamber was covered? Sunlight behaves one way in a space open to the sky, and another way in a space that's been darkened on purpose. In an unroofed model, the chamber is an open enclosure. Light enters from above throughout the day, shadows drift across the pillars, and any winter solstice effect becomes one highlight among many. A low-angle beam can still happen. Sunlight can thread through an entrance or gap, but it competes with the general brightness. The sun is there all day, so it never really arrives. In a roofed or partially roofed model, the chamber becomes a controlled instrument. Darkness sets the baseline. The same winter sun that looks ordinary outside becomes dramatic inside, because a narrow opening admits light as a defined shape rather than a wash. With a roof, a beam can read like a cue. Without one, it's harder to separate from everything else. Even partial cover could do the job. A canopy, a screened roof, a layered ceiling that blocks overhead glare while still allowing ventilation and access. The problem is that roofs rarely survive. Stone walls remain, organic coverings vanish. Even stone roofing can collapse, then be reused, removed, or buried. So archaeologists are left inferring what was once above the space from indirect traces: joinery, wall thickness, sockets, collapse patterns, and how the architecture channels movement. Reconstruction choices change more than lighting. A roof shifts acoustics. It changes airflow, smell, smoke behavior, and how tightly a crowd feels packed together. Anyone who's been in a dark cinema versus an outdoor screening knows how much cover changes attention, even when the story is the same. So the debate isn't only about a beam, it's about atmosphere. One version of Karahan Tepe is an open ritual enclosure under the sky. Another is a contained room where light becomes rare enough to notice, and its timing becomes something a group can anticipate. If you were brought here in midwinter, would you trust an open enclosure under the sky, or a roofed chamber where darkness makes the light feel like it's on purpose? Which version sounds more persuasive to you?
If a beam of winter light entered the chamber, it didn't enter a blank room. Karahan Tepe's interior is crowded with possibilities. Upright pillars ring the space, Stone Phalloi break up the floor, and emerging from one wall, a carved human head meets the interior with a fixed, unblinking presence. Any one of these could be where attention naturally settles. The human head stands apart. It isn't decorative filler.
and it isn't repeated the way other elements are. Carved directly from stone, it feels embedded rather than placed, as if it belongs to the chamber itself. In a dim interior, light across a face would be difficult to ignore. Human features get recognized instantly. Even a partial illumination pulls focus in a way a flat surface doesn't. The pillars complicate the idea of a single target. They aren't random verticals. Their spacing and orientation create sightlines, corridors of vision that steer where a standing person tends to look. A beam traveling through this space doesn't just hit an object, it passes bodies, threads between stones, and moves across a field of upright forms. The path can be the message, not just the endpoint. There's also the possibility that the most important element is missing. Organic materials, wooden posts, textiles, painted surfaces, even suspended objects, rarely survive in stone ruins. A beam could have been meant to touch something temporary, a skull brought out for the season, a mask, a bundle of bones, an object carried in and removed afterward. In that case, the beam wouldn't confirm a carving so much as cue a performance. A beam without a focal point is just illumination. A beam arriving in a space already dense with forms, faces, and boundaries becomes selective. One thing bright, everything else receding. That's familiar even now. A spotlight doesn't add new objects to a stage. It decides what the audience is allowed to see. Karahan Tepe doesn't tell us exactly what the light touched. It suggests that whatever it touched was meant to be seen by everyone in the room, and rare enough that people would wait for it. Karahan Tepe is constantly introduced through Göbekli Tepe, and that comparison is useful, up to a point. They come from the same early world, close enough in geography and time to share ideas, tools, and ritual habits. But standing in one doesn't prepare you for the other. They feel built for different kinds of gathering. Göbekli's best-known spaces feel outward-facing. Tall, T-shaped pillars dominate wide enclosures. The architecture reads from a distance, like a stage designed for visibility. Even as ruins, it's easy to picture crowds orienting toward towering forms and carved animals, with the sky overhead and the surrounding landscape still part of the experience. Karahan Tepe turns you inward. The sunken chamber draws bodies down rather than inviting them to look up. The space tightens. Features crowd the floor and walls, shaping how people can stand and where they can focus. Instead of spectacle, it creates proximity. Instead of an open arena, it creates a room with edges. That shift changes what astronomy would even mean at each site. In an open enclosure, the horizon and sky are simply there, part of the setting. In a controlled interior, the sky has to be framed through an entrance, an aperture, a deliberate line of sight, a moment when light can reach inside an otherwise dim space. It's the difference between watching a live event outdoors and watching it through a doorway, where timing and viewpoint are suddenly part of the experience. The imagery pushes in the same directions. Göbekli's animal reliefs pull attention outward into the wild world. Predators, prey, danger, power. Karahan Tepe's chamber feels more bodily and confrontational. Forms underfoot, a head emerging from stone. Elements that insist on human presence in a confined space. Together, the sites read as variation rather than duplication. A shared culture can build more than one kind of sacred architecture at once, places for gathering under open sky, and places for descending into controlled environments where light, sound, and attention can be managed. Karahan Tepe doesn't need to be Göbekli but smaller. It can be its own script.
Karahan Tepe changes character the moment you stop thinking of it as that one strange chamber. Non-invasive surveys, ground-penetrating radar, and other mapping methods have hinted that the visible excavation is just a small part of the site. Beneath the surface, patterns emerge.
Anomalies with edges, curves, and repeated shapes that don't look like natural geology. They look like planned features. That matters because it shifts how we see the sunken chamber. A single dramatic room can be explained as an experiment, a one-off, a local oddity. But a wider spread of buried architecture suggests something that was maintained, something a community kept building onto, returning to, and organizing over time. Rather than a lone temple, Karahan starts to resemble a ritual landscape with multiple stations, places to move between, not just one place you enter and leave. In a larger complex, the chamber becomes one node in a sequence. People could gather in open areas, move toward enclosed spaces, descend into the sunken room, then re-emerge, movement itself creating a kind of ritual grammar. The site's layout can generate timing without a clock, bottlenecks that slow a crowd, thresholds that separate roles, routes that turn a walk into a ceremony. This expanded site changes how we think about the solstice beam. A beam inside one chamber is a striking detail. In a complex with multiple structures, that game becomes one part of a larger cycle, one moment that could anchor a seasonal calendar rather than stand alone. The solstice doesn't have to be the only purpose. It could be the most dramatic cue in a schedule of events tied to the weather, animals, planting, memory, and social obligation. We still haven't uncovered everything. But as more hidden features emerge beneath the soil, it becomes harder to see Karahan Tepe as just one mystery room. It starts to look like a designed environment, one built to hold repeated human behavior in place. The carved head at Karahan Tepe makes more sense when it's placed back into its wider Neolithic setting. Across parts of the early Near East, skulls were treated differently from the rest of the body. Graves were reopened. Skulls were removed, curated, and sometimes altered, plastered to rebuild facial contours, painted, or kept for a time among the living. The pattern shows up often enough to feel like a shared way of handling memory, not a rare exception. In that context, a skull isn't just a remnant, it carries recognition. A face is identity in the most immediate form, and separating the head from the body changes what the dead become. Not simply absent, but present in a different way. Kept close, displayed, passed between hands, a skull can make ancestry tangible, something a community can literally gather around. Karahan Tepe's carved head isn't bone, and that difference may be the point. Bone is portable, temporary, vulnerable. Stone is fixed. A face emerging from the architecture can anchor practices that would otherwise leave little trace. Seasonal display, offerings, spoken names, repeated gestures, rites that need a focal presence even when the human remains themselves are moved or reburied. The chamber becomes a place where face is permanent, whether or not an actual skull is present that day. Winter adds weight without needing certainty. Winter compresses hardship, food stress, illness, loss, and many societies load that season with rituals about endurance and return. A sunken space that gathers people close together, confronting them with a human face that can't be ignored, fits that emotional logic. The head doesn't have to represent a named person to work. It only has to be unmistakably human. The chamber, then, isn't just architecture, and it isn't just symbolism. It functions like a memory device, turning recognition into atmosphere, and atmosphere into tradition, in a world where the boundary between the living and the dead could be revisited and staged.
To understand whether Karahan Tepe could have worked as a winter marker, you don't start with belief, you start with the sky. The sun's path is predictable over long spans of time, and that predictability makes it possible to reconstruct ancient light conditions with modern tools. Plot the winter solstice sun for this region, and you see how low it rides. The arc stays close to the horizon, and that low angle makes small differences matter. Shift an opening by a few degrees, raise or lower a wall slightly. Suddenly, light either reaches the interior or misses it completely.
If sunlight repeatedly reaches the same spot inside a chamber at the winter solstice, it does so within narrow tolerances. Simulation helps because it lets you test those tolerances without rebuilding the site in stone. Put a virtual observer inside different reconstructions, roofed, partially roofed, open, and you can see which configurations allow light to penetrate, when it arrives, and how long it lasts. In one model, a beam slides across the floor and stalls behind a pillar. In another, it never forms at all. In a third, it appears briefly, then disappears, consistent enough to anticipate, short enough to feel like an event. It's not unlike running lighting cues for a stage show. Change the angle, change the opening, and the moment either hits or it doesn't. The surrounding landscape matters too. Hills and ridges alter when the sun first becomes visible. A rise on the horizon can delay sunrise by minutes, sometimes enough to change whether light reaches an interior feature. Add that horizon profile to the simulation, and the window narrows further. None of this proves intention on its own. It can't tell us what people believed or why they gathered, but it can tell us whether the physical claim is plausible. Does the architecture allow winter solstice light to behave in a controlled, repeatable way? If it does, then any meaning built on top of it rests on something dependable, a sky that arrives on time every year, regardless of what people believe about it. Karahan Tepe doesn't give us a clear label for what it was. It doesn't announce itself as a temple, an observatory, or a calendar. What it offers instead is a set of constraints, a sunken chamber that narrows movement, upright forms that organize bodies, darkness that makes light noticeable, and an opening that may have admitted winter solstice sun at the one point in the year when its return carried the most weight. Those constraints don't read like decoration, they read like design. A winter solstice beam inside a darkened room isn't just information about the season, it's an event. It happens whether you believe in it or not, and everyone present experiences it at the same time. The architecture doesn't just mark time, it coordinates people. Imagine a group packed into that chamber, shoulders close, breath visible, eyes adjusting to the dark. No one needs to announce the moment, the light does it. Heads turn together. A hush spreads the way it does in a theater when the house lights drop. Automatic, shared, almost physical. The power isn't the sun touching a particular stone, it's what that cue does to a crowd. That's the fun fact I promised. The solstice beam isn't the point by itself. The point is the crowd, how the room turns a cosmic event into a shared, timed experience. If this interpretation holds, Karahan Tepe suggests something rare in deep prehistory. Not astronomy for observation's sake, but astronomy as ritual technology. A way to turn the weakest light of the year into a dependable signal, and a dependable signal into cohesion, long before clocks, calendars, or written law. That may be why people returned. In a world without guarantees, a place that could make the turning of the year feel predictable, publicly, together, would have been worth the effort carved into every surface. If this changed how you think about ancient astronomy, tell me which reconstruction you find more convincing, roofed or open, and what you think the winter light was meant to touch. Share the video, drop your take in the comments, and subscribe to Armchair Archaeology for more Past with a Pulse. Tap the bell so you don't miss the next dig. On screen now, DNA reveals the true origin of the Philistines for a perfect companion watch, or the full Middle East playlist for the bigger picture, both linked below. Until next time, keep questioning, stay curious, and remember, the first calendars weren't written down. They were built into stone, timed to the sky, and designed to move people together. Long before clocks or calendars, time itself was a shared experience, and its echoes are still shaping how we gather today.